So it's my great pleasure to invite you and welcome you all to the launch of the Canadian Council for the Americas, Beyond the Build, a new Canadian strategy for Latin America and the Caribbean. My name is Marta Blackwell, and I'm the Vice President of the Canadian Council for the Americas. It is my pleasure to serve as your host this morning. Before we begin, I would want to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet on this land. We also recognize the diverse Indigenous peoples from across the Americas, from the Arctic to Patagonia, whose lands, knowledge, and partnerships are integral to the hemispheric relations we'll be discussing today. It's wonderful to see so many of you here in person today in Ottawa, and we're equally delighted to welcome all of those joining us virtually from across the region and the world. We're particularly honored to be joined by so many distinguished guests. A special welcome to senators, parliamentarians, ambassadors, and representatives who are with us today from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Guatemala, Guyana, Jamaica, Mexico, Peru, Panama, and El Salvador, as well as friends from Georgia, Hungary, Indonesia, Philippines, Slovenia, and the Slovak Republic. Thank you all for joining us today. Yes. We're also very grateful to have with us senior officials from several federal departments, business leaders, academics, and many friends. Your presence here underscores the importance of the region and the strategy that we're proposing, as well as the partnerships we hope to strengthen. For those of you who may be new to the Canadian Council for the Americas, let me take just a quick moment to tell you who we are. The Canadian Council for the Americas is Canada's forum for dialogue and thought leadership with the hemisphere's leading actors and networks on economic, political, and social issues. We frame issues and originate private conversations for Canada's C-suite with interests in the hemisphere. We're nonpartisan and member-based. So, what can you expect this morning? In just a moment, I'll invite CCA's president, Ken Frankel, to the stage. Ken will provide an overview of the project we're here to discuss, what we set out to do with this strategy, and why it matters now more than ever. Following Ken's remarks, we'll move on to a conversation led by our project editor-in-chief, Amanda Lang. Amanda will be joined by the lead developers of the strategy, our co-chairs, Janice Stein and Jonathan Hausman, and who also serves as chair of the CCA Board of Directors, and our principal authors, Eric Miller, John Price, and Doug Saunders. Ken and I will also be joining them on stage. And this is where you all come in. For those of you in the room, in front of you, you'll see some QR codes. We will be requesting that you send all questions through the Slido app that you can access from those QR codes in front of you. For those of you who are joining us virtually, we do request that you submit any questions through the Q&A, which will lead you to the Slido page, and you can submit those questions there. Amanda will be moderating them from the stage. And you can submit those questions at any time. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to invite to the stage a driving force behind the CCA and the strategy we are here to discuss, the President of the Canadian Council for the Americas, Ken Frankel.
Thank you, Marta. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, as Marta said, in Ottawa and from around the globe. And I also want to thank many of you who have known about this project for a while and wanted to see it maybe sooner than we're delivering it. So thank you for your forbearance. We thank the many contributors throughout the Americas and Europe who generously shared their insights and assisted us in the preparation of the strategy. You'll find their names in the acknowledgement page of the strategy paper. But one person deserves special recognition. This project would not have begun or been sustained without the generous financial support of Ms. Nancy Southern. Nancy imposed no preconditions and attached no strings to how we undertook our work or to the conclusions and recommendations we reached. Thank you, Nancy. Almost 2 years ago, the CCA took on a mandate to author a strategy on how Canada could rethink its approach to Latin America and the Caribbean, a region where Canada arguably has its largest and historically deepest footprint. Canada has the strongest potential to impact itself and its partners, and where, despite its reduced engagement recently, Canada is still admired. Latin America and the Caribbean is also a region whose nation's demographic growth, resource wealth, and economic shifts create an opportunity for engagement that benefits Canada domestically while complementing the priorities of our regional partners. Today, that opportunity has become more compelling as current geopolitical economic shifts have created a moment for change and a call for action. Canada is taking steps to build at home. It is investing in housing, infrastructure, natural resources, security, and skills. And it is actively seeking to diversify its markets and broaden its economic reach. To propel that momentum and those efforts, Canada needs to seize opportunities across the Americas. To do so, it needs a new strategy. We believe that our report, Beyond the Build, is precisely that strategy. It lays out how Canada can accelerate economic growth and diversify risk by deepening trade relationships across the Americas. And it provides targeted government actions that link our national build and the growing needs of the Americas with novel yet implementable recommendations for policymakers to capitalize on a moment of shared opportunity. We are recommending that Canada prioritize 5 economic growth drivers to create prosperity at home and expand trade within the Americas. First, activate underused free trade agreements already in place in economies valued in the trillions of dollars. Second, create business consortia and tax incentives that spur investment and build on infrastructure across the region. Third, create a critical mineral strategy that leverages Canadian resource sector expertise to strengthen Canada's position in the hemispheric value chain. Fourth, approach migration as a strategic tool to address specific human capital needs and regional security. And fifth, use Canadian expertise to strengthen trade and cybersecurity to de-risk supply chains and address Canadian security gaps. Our blueprint aligns opportunity with action and is adaptable on a country-by-country basis. It takes a long-term view and shows how restructuring our approaches and thinking can spur Canada's chances to succeed. For example, our trade analysis starts at the point where traditional trade analysis ends. That is, many Latin American export profiles may look a lot like ours, so the fit can appear limited. Our paper, a typical trade complementary, so the fit can appear limited. On paper, a typical trade complementary index might reinforce that view. But indices capture what exists and not what is possible. We can no longer treat FTAs as finished products. They are platforms to be activated. The paper provides innovative ways on how to utilize the FTAs as scaffolding for new initiatives. As we look ahead, the insights and recommendations outlined in our report, Beyond the Build, are just the beginning of a vital conversation about Canada's role in Latin America and the Caribbean. To delve deeper into these ideas and explore how we can collectively turn these strengths into action, I am pleased to introduce Amanda Lang, our project editor-in-chief and today's moderator. Amanda will lead a discussion with our executive committee members and principal authors, unpacking the recommendations and sharing their perspectives on how we can capitalize on this moment. Please join me in welcoming Amanda to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to ask everybody to join me on stage because they have the content that you're here to learn more about. I do have the Slido app in my hand. I'll be looking for your questions, so please do send them. That's a bit complicated. Janice second last. Jonathan beside Janice. Yeah. You're going to go Marta. Marta. You're in the middle. There you go. And beside you. Thank you all. Many of these folks need no introduction. I'm just going to briefly introduce them so you know. Marta Blackwell, of course, you already know, the CCA. Janice Stein likely needs no introduction to anybody in Canada or elsewhere. She is executive chair of this project, though, and has been an enormously impactful one. She is also, of course, the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, among many other things. Jonathan Hausman, who is co-chair of this project, and as you heard, chair of the Canadian Council of the Americas. And our subject matter authors, Doug Saunders is the Globe and Mail's international affairs columnist. He's a multiple award-winning journalist, has run 2 foreign bureaus, and has written 3 books on immigration. John Price is managing director of America's Market Intelligence, extensive experience throughout this region. Many of you will know him, including founding what became the largest market intelligence firm before it was sold to Kroll. He consults across 20 industries with 1,200 client engagements over the course of time across Latin America. Eric Miller, also well known to many of you, a trade consultant, president now of Rideau Potomac Strategy Group, extensive regional experience, including 8 years as a consultant with the trade division of the Inter-American Development Bank. So you have to cherry pick their accomplishments, and he's probably thinking, why did you pick that one? That's the one I picked. And Ken Frankel, of course, who definitely needs no introduction. All of you, thank you for being here. And I want to work through this material because there's a lot to cover here, but I'm going to start with you, Jonathan. Because you and Janice, actually, I'd like you both sort of take a run at this. You undertook this for a reason, which is really why Latin America. And one of the things I find most compelling about the proposals is that it is different. It's a shift in thinking about the region, and that's important. So in the context of why you thought this was important, what is that shift? What does it represent?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Amanda. And yeah, we were drawn to this project for at least 3 reasons. The first is the moment that we are in as a nation, and also where we are globally. The world has changed, and that may sound trite, but the truth is it has implications. And it has changed in a very important way for Canada because we were the biggest beneficiary of hyperglobalization as a middle power with access, with wealth that can be created from that access. That has changed. And so that world has become much more fragmented. That world has become much more unreliable. And so the first real interest I had in this project, other than being the chair of the CCA, of course, is that this answers the question of what do we do now? And I want to emphasize one thing, that this focus on Latin America and the Caribbean is additive. It is not to replace other strategies, it is additive. We need as many arrows in the quiver as we can find. And that moment means that we have to actually move beyond, as Ken mentioned, free trade agreements as being somehow immediate entree. It is hard work. We've cited some examples, so the authors have cited examples of countries that have been sweating this access question, sweating this economic globalism question for a lot longer than us, and we have a lot to learn. The second reason is that the region itself has changed. So Latin America has generally been viewed, Caribbean in addition, as being sort of off to the side. It is central. It has stepped out of the periphery, and you have 3 G20 countries. You've got 160 million middle-class people, defined as 24,000 GDP per capita, and you have a region that combined is $4 trillion market. $4 trillion. So this is not a question of and. There's just some things to do. This is actually about changing the landscape of our markets. And third, I also think that it's become clear, and that the government is leading the way here, that we need a totally different mindset as to how we mobilize Canadians and Canadian resources and Canadian business and Canadian policy in an entirely different way. And I think that is the most exciting part, frankly, of this paper, is that it really begins to talk about our international role, our international economic engagement in a way that is far more sustainable, far more effective, and one that is going to involve many different parts of our Canadian landscape, business, policy, culture, our society, as well as our academic institutions, and even things that we have viewed as being generally administrative questions like immigration, my colleague Doug talked about. It's a strategic tool.
And to me, that's actually one of the most exciting things about the set of proposals is they build off domestic actions and they reinforce domestic advantage. This isn't a separate, this isn't an add, it's actually integral to what our government's trying to do. Janice, the geopolitical is highly relevant here, of course, and there are advantages to Canada acting now and acting in these ways. Just place the region for us and its importance.
You know, just thank you, Amanda. Just to build on what Jonathan just said, we make this trite comment, the world has changed. The tougher issues are, how has it changed? What are the alternative ways of understanding where we're going, and what opportunities are there for Canada? Well, I think one obvious one is regions matter more in this world. When the architecture breaks apart, and that's what's happened, is that the global architecture is broken apart, regions become more important, and Latin America is the neglected, frankly, close cousin of Canada, which is really astonishing. And I think, you know, the real advantage of this report, it just calls that out for what it is. Jonathan's comment is really important. This is not binary. Canadians have to be able to do more than one thing at a time, right? So this report looks at the region, which is geographically closest to us, and says, where can we work together on issues that are of shared interest? And let me just introduce you for a second. And the final factor is that there is geopolitical competition. In Latin America, Chinese are present in very significant ways, both embedded in value supply chains that really matter to us, but also there are security challenges that come from the growing presence of China in a region that is close to us. If you look at the security chapter, which Eric wrote, and I loved, frankly, what struck me, and I hope this strikes you as well, that there's a very specific set of very practical, grounded recommendations of what we have to do. You know, one of the more interesting ones, we need to create an international cyber security corps. Long overdue, and as I reread the chapter, these are things that Canadians need to do anyway in the changing world. but we have a historic opportunity to do it in partnership with countries in Latin America.
And Ken, I just want to say, obviously you have a deep understanding of the region. Canada has a long engagement in the region. What feels different to you about this? What's new about this set of proposals?
Well, thank you, Amanda. I thought I had a deep understanding of the region until I worked more closely with all these people. I realized how little I actually know going into this. I learned a lot. I think the salient point about this strategy is it meets this moment, and it's designed to fit in as an integral component of what the government is trying to do to prosper and survive, precisely in the context that Janice and Jonathan just laid out.
So let's get to some of the meat, because there are novel concepts here. Eric, I'm going to start with you, because this is the order of the chapters. But one of the things that I will note is we have chapter authors, but the policies all fit together, and that's an important part of this document. They're not in isolation. On trade, this is a very important idea, because for a long time Canada did a really good job of inking trade agreements and then letting them sit there, hoping Canadian businesses would take them up, and they haven't. And this region is 8 free trade agreements, many trade and protection agreements, nothing, of course, by way of follow-through. Not nothing, but in terms of activation, the novel ideas you've come up with, just talk about that, the shift around, it's a little bit more active engagement on the part of policymakers to say that we're going to actually do something here.
Yeah. So the old model was kind of like the movie Field of Dreams, where we said, if you build it, they will come. And that has proven not to be true. And so part of what is different in this moment is that Canada needs a different set of partnerships and a different set of policies that would see Canadian firms working together in consortia that governments help to organize, that look at, for example, partnerships in the region that would see new processing facilities for oil seeds, for example, that would be sold in the local market but would be fueled by long-term offtake agreements. And so you can underpin the financing by having those sort of offtake agreements so that the local market gets the supply it needs for its growing middle class, and you have the offtake from Canada. We've looked at also a whole series of things around information. And so there are a lot of Canadian firms that look at trade agreements and they frankly find them a mystery. And as you say in the beautifully edited version of the paper, this is about taking rules of origin, for example, from being a mystery to a workflow. And so it's how do we make it easy for Canadian firms to export, but most importantly, it's how do we find a way for Canada and its firms to collaborate. We also need to understand that this is not just about commodities. So you look at things such as oil field services and equipment, agro industry. Only 3% of the agro machinery that Canada produces ends up in Latin America. Why? When I look at the great producers in the Southern Cone, for example, why is it that there is not Canadian agro machinery that is ending up there? And part of it is that we've had this idea that the market will figure it out on its own. And of course, the market is critically important, but you need, in this moment when everybody else is pursuing radical industrial policy, you need a smart set of collaborations that allow Canada to sell more to the region and allow Canadian firms and firms in Latin America to build projects together in a way that we haven't seen before.
Which gets at this consortium approach. We learn from others. Some of this has been done by other countries in other ways. You can't pluck wholesale. Every country will be different. And in fact, every country we engage with in the region will be different. Just address that there's a set of strategies here that are really, as you say, part of this meeting the moment. The invisible hand idea, we're going to set that aside and say, actually, government can be involved, should be involved. There is a place here to work across the whole value chain of your economy. But it will be different in Chile and Argentina. And just sort of talk through how you see this functioning.
So we took inspiration in many respects from Japan and Korea. And so if you want to be a great trading nation, you need to look at other great trading nations and what they do and know that their context is different than our context. But I remember being in Beijing and talking to a gentleman in the wastewater business from Quebec City, and he said the embassy in Indonesia told him, well, get involved in Japanese supply chains. Well, those supply chains weren't built through classic neoliberal models from Adam Smith of comparative advantage. They were built through collaborations between the public sector and the private sector in Southeast Asia. And of course, in terms of implementation, these strategies are meant to be applied everywhere, but differently in different ways. And so you could look at this, say, in the power sector in Jamaica, or you could look at this in terms of building infrastructure in Brazil or in Chile. And so the models are essentially organize capital, get large and mid-sized and smaller Canadian firms in a coherent group, find good local partners in the region, and deliver projects. So if you're looking at a toll road, for example, or a toll bridge that has a long-term revenue stream attached to it, that becomes a very attractive investment proposition. But Canada takes the initiative by working with private funders and perhaps public guarantees to get that capital organized to begin with so that that project can be delivered and that you have long-term value created both for the economy in the region in terms of greater transportation efficiency and also for Canadian firms who would be owning and operating or co-owning and operating this infrastructure in the region. And so you can do it with commodity processing, you can do it with infrastructure, a whole series of things, even through services such as cybersecurity.
One of the real driving forces from our co-chairs was that this should be practical and implementable. There was no kind of grand vision that would sit in a drawer that they were welcoming. They're too busy, and too. I think they thought this was too important. There's a host of things in the trade chapter that are just that. They're great ideas. Some of the sort of post-FTA activation strategies, things like a tax diversification credit, micro incentives for supply chain, a digital trade toolkit. Are there any that you think are particularly important? Do you think that, if there are a few that really need to be that you like the best?
Yeah, so let's look at micro incentives, for example. And so that would mean that a company could claim a discrete benefit, whether it's delivered in the form of a subsidy or a tax credit or something of that nature, if they were to add Canadian content to their supply chains. And so this is something that the Koreans do. The Koreans have a model where their equivalent of the Department of Industry knows so much about their local supply chain that they'll even call up Korean companies and say, I see you're sourcing such and such from Australia. There's a good Korean company that could do that. You don't have to switch. There may be reasons why you're buying from Australia, but you can help to facilitate that switch to the local production. Or they do the same thing on the outbound side to say, oh, your company is selling a lot to such and such a country, and you can add Korean value. And so what we have to think about is trade not as this grand concept that is, it's not about architecture as much as it's about plumbing. And
Love
so
that.
this is really about being granular and making this work on a practical level, and adding value, adding Canadian suppliers to supply chains is something that needs to be focused on, celebrated, and frankly, rewarded.
And Canada has deep exposure and experience in natural resources. Many of the concepts in the trade chapter are applicable in the resources sector, but it deserved its own attention. And we have John Price for that, because, of course, it's a place to start, but it's also a place of strategic value and importance in the world right now, particularly certain classes, of course, of resources. Critical minerals are top of mind for governments everywhere. They're geopolitically important, they're economically important. Your chapter suggests a new framework for that across the hemisphere. Just to give us the elevator pitch on the Latin American Minerals Partnership.
Well, the term Canada-Latin American Minerals Partnership is built on two pillars. One is economic opportunity, the other is geopolitical imperative. The economic opportunity recognizes the fact that between Canada and Latin America, we capture 50% of the world's mining investment. And there's very good complementarianism between the resources in Latin America and the resources in Canada. Canada is not a strong source of copper and lithium. Latin America leads the world in both of those metals. Both of those metals are part of what I would call critical or strategic metals that the world needs. And so there is an opportunity for the Canadian mining industry to rebound, and I'm going to be direct here, after a decade of Ottawa overreach and a lack of diplomatic support for our mining industry abroad. This is a moment for Canada's mining industry to revive itself. It requires both a simplification and removal of a lot of duplication of regulations. Today, it takes the average Canadian mine 19.9 years to go from concept to operations. That's too long. That's not competitive. If we want our Canadian mining industry, which is our most competitive global industry, to thrive, not only do we have to make life easier for mining companies in Canada, but we have to give them the opportunity to partner with Latin American countries that also want a strong mining industry. And that's the economic opportunity. The geopolitical imperative everybody's reading about these days is the fact that the world depends upon China for 60 to 95% of the processed metals that go into so many of our strategic industries. And that is not just a source of vulnerability that is being voiced in Washington, it's equally voiced in Europe, it's equally voiced in Japan, in India, and elsewhere. And so the world is calling for a bifurcation, at least a bifurcation, of supply lines of critical metals. And that means that we, i.e. Canada and Latin America, cannot continue to just extract. We have to also process. We have to develop downstream capabilities. And this has been an ambition of every major Latin American mining country. They welcome the investment, they benefit from the royalties and the taxes, but politically it has always been a source of anxiety and frustration that there has not been enough investment in the downstream areas of the industry. And so CLAMP is really about marshaling together two of Canada's greatest industries, mining and finance, and putting together a packaged approach, particularly in areas like lithium, where it's the governments that control the concessions. And those governments will respond positively to an offer by Canada that includes not just mining, but also processing and even battery production. And so this is not only something that's welcome in Latin America, but it's a way of differentiating Canada from other mining competitors around the world.
And I think it's important to note that, I mean, we've seen Canada has been working on other similar mineral security partnerships around the world. This is a theme. We understand the value. One of the things that I think is important about this, in the context of this paper, and how it ties to some of the things that Eric talks about, is that this is really about strategic engagement that's an economic relationship. There's an overlay, of course, that's about partnership and agreeing and standards, and it's very much a two-way. This is not an imposition by Canada on other countries. This is a relationship, but it is one that is informed by our domestic interests, our partners' domestic interests. It's an economic relationship, in other words. It's not just a chance to sit around and talk. Jonathan, you sound like you want
I'm just going to emphasize one thing, is the name of the report, Beyond the Build. So we're putting in this country a lot of emphasis on resources and developing our domestic capacity. It's really important to get those products to market. But what goes beyond is the global scale. And I think what John is talking about is that we have the capacity to become preponderant. And that is combining the refocusing on our domestic capacity at the same time as layering on these relationships and partnerships in the Latin American Caribbean region. And to me, that is emblematic of the kind of thinking that we think is really needed today.
Now, I'm getting questions from the room, and it's not surprising given some of the people that are in the room, about the role that Ottawa plays here and Ottawa's level of engagement. I'm looking at you, Janice, but John, you might have a thought as well, and that is, we have a deep history in this region, and I think still a pretty good reputation on a lot of fronts. We've laid the groundwork of strong relationships, but maybe not invested the way we might have in recent years. How do we build on this?
So I think, again, it's so important to situate this report in the moment. Right? To be blunt, every one of these chapters is about strategy. And that strategy is true in the trade chapter. It's true in the critical resources chapter. It's true on immigration, as Doug will tell you, and it's true on security. What's different about this? This is explicit. This is an age of smart industrial policy that is driven by these geopolitical changes. And Ottawa, the momentum is already moving in that direction, frankly. We're not here advocating something that's not already being done by the current government, but what we are pushing very hard, very concrete, practical partnerships that are grounded, that will produce results for both partners, but they will not happen if the government isn't in on the ground from the beginning. And I think that's very important. And Ottawa being there on the ground, working with partners to give content, very specific content to these strategies, is what is going to make certain that our partners benefit as well, that there are shared benefits between Canada and our Latin American partners. So this is the age of strategy. That's what happens when geopolitics comes roaring back.
Yes, John?
Adding on to the concept that's been laid out by Jonathan and Janice, that this is not that we're really trying to leverage the assets we already have. And a great example of that is in Peru today. Government affairs, or global affairs, has a team of people who are dedicated to supporting Peru's desire to develop a environmentally sensitive mining industry that is respectful of labor laws, that is respectful of local communities. The idea being to position Canadian mining in a way that helps those governments convince their own people and convince all of the businesses in that country that there's a space for good mining practices. And because a lot of Latin American governments, we've seen this in Panama, we've seen this in the DR, we've seen this in the Colombia. Although there are strong advocates of mining, there is a urban voter who associates mining with dirty practices, with bad labor practices, et cetera. So there needs to be a counter voice to that negativity. And Canada has the track record. We didn't come by it easily. It took decades of mistakes and decades of local community stakeholders correcting the operational ways of Canadian mining. But today, Canadian mining stands on the world's shoulders in terms of setting standards around community relations, about good environmental design, et cetera. And that message needs to be constantly communicated. And our Latin American partners want our help to do that. They want our help to spread that word, because they are battling with an informal mining sector, a mining sector with less integral players who damage the reputation of the industry. So this is about leveraging our already goodwill in these countries with a more industry-focused, knowledge-based approach.
And I would say that one of the strengths that is a through line of this strategy is that it takes Canadian learning and understanding and partners with the region for kind of mutual benefit.
Yep.
And that includes our Indigenous populations, our ESG, clean technology, all the things that we, in this report, think of as exportable services, importable services. I'm going to skip security, although nobody should really, and go to Doug Saunders, because we're talking about kind of the partnerships, and human capital is really a hugely important part of our relationship. You have some really interesting strategies, 7 in total, but I think the most important thing is a shift in the way to think about it as a strategic domestic lever. In other words, this is something that is valuable to Canada. We're thinking about this slightly differently than we have in the past.
That's right. What's new here is we're looking at migration governance as a strategic instrument that can be used to build ties between Canada and its partners in the Americas, economic ties, political ties, diplomatic ties, through the engagement in shared projects. So we're not talking about a new immigration program or new immigration levels, either for Canada or for the countries of the Americas. Instead, look at it as a menu of shared projects, bilateral and multilateral projects that we can engage in together to confront shared challenges and problems in the areas of migration, asylum, border security, and so on. And in some cases, complementary opportunities and needs between Canada and its partner countries.
The nation building strategy, just walk through a little bit. This is a domestic facing agenda, but with kind of regional benefits.
Right, so one of the 7 projects is what I'm calling the Nation Builder Fast Track Regional Immigration Program for Skilled Trades. It looks at Canada's new urgent priority on so-called nation-building programs in creating housing and critical infrastructure at high speed, which will create very sudden demand for specific skilled trades in specific places at specific times. And the idea is to use Canada's existing pathways generally to match up our specific regional needs with specific countries in the Americas that have labor surpluses, that have demographic surpluses, that have surpluses of educated or skilled trades and trade-related professions that are interested in partnering at this. At the same time as understanding that Canada is trying to shift from a regime of temporary migration to one of permanent family-based, permanent resident settlement.
Which also gets at that issue, which would be a domestic response, but it's an important political consideration, which is that immigration lands in a certain way today, and it's important to kind of build that in. And one of the things you've done is build into the framework some resiliency around how it can meet those moments, not just today, but going forward. How does that work?
That's right. Well, I mean, another proposal that I think would be of mutual interest across the region is to restart what was known as the Safe Mobility Network. This was a program, short-lived, never successful, designed to confront the real and continuing problem that a lot of the countries from Panama on upward to Canada face pressures on their southern borders from flight migration and humanitarian crises in Venezuela, Haiti, a number of other places, and can't deal with these things unilaterally. And by the way, a lot of countries from Ecuador on downward face pressures on their northern borders as well. This was a Biden-era approach to set up portals and offices across the migration pathway to allow people to apply for regular pathways in a range of countries in the Americas and in Europe, to shift them from approaching southern borders to applying for regular pathways. It never worked. Because for a number of reasons, and it was canceled in early 2025 because of the political situation in the United States. We're proposing that Canada can lead a restarting of this type of a multilateral solution to flight migration based on the principles, but not necessarily the specific methods and technologies that the United States did.
I want to now come to security, Eric, your other chapter. And again, it's wonderful that you wrote both because, as with all of these subjects, they are deeply entwined.
Yeah.
One of the things you're doing is very much rooting that concept of security here at home, our own ports, our own borders. Just start with sort of your starting point of what Canada needs to think about when it thinks about security in the region, particularly, I guess, with transnational criminal organizations, which is sort of was a starting point of, it's a flashpoint for the government here.
Yeah, one of the great challenges that countries in the region are facing is the rise and growth of transnational criminal organizations. And so you look at levels of violence that have arisen and the increasing connectivity of these organizations to partners across the world. And so when asked the question of, well, what can Canada do on this? The best thing Canada can do is to strengthen its own infrastructure at home. And so, for example, there is no dedicated port police at ports of entry in Halifax, in Vancouver, in Montreal. So as a result, they become transshipment points for narcotics that come from Latin America and are maybe going to Australia, or from Latin America to Europe or to Canada itself. You've seen growth of connections between organized crime in Canada and organized crime in Latin America, just like there has been with organized crime in other parts of the world. And so Canada needs to undertake a series of measures, including seriously addressing issues around money laundering. One of the things that we saw with the run-up in property prices in Vancouver was an awful lot of money washed through casinos. This started with the Chinese triads, but then the Chinese triads generously offered the casino option to their friends in Latin America. And so you've seen Canada become a through country for money laundering in a way that it shouldn't be. You've also seen Canada not have the sort of legal infrastructure in place like they have, for example, in the United States under the so-called RICO Act. What the RICO Act does is it allows you to link patterns of behavior together to put a bigger story together. The U.S. Customs can do this on the good side. So, for example, on cases around forced labor and suspicions around that, whereas Canada has a situation where CBSA is only limited to looking at an import-by-import basis. And so this is about Canada modernizing its own infrastructure, and then also, as it modernizes its infrastructure, looking at how can it enhance its channels with other Latin American governments to be mutually beneficial. For too long, Canada really relied on other partners, especially the U.S., for knowledge and awareness about ground realities in Latin America. And Canada needs to develop its own independent capability at the same time as it is fixing vulnerabilities in its own legal, regulatory, and law enforcement regimes.
Amanda, if I could just jump in a minute. This chapter is great because it calls out the sacred cows. All right, to be blunt, we know we need to do much more than we're doing, but we danced around it. This chapter lays it out and tells Canadians what we need to do, and we need to do this irrespective. It also will have huge benefits for our strategic partnerships with Latin America.
And it truly is a beyond the build set of strategies. I mean, we are investing tens and tens of billions of dollars in ports, in trade infrastructure. The budget just laid out new money for transportation infrastructure related to trade. Why not spend it on hardening our ports and making us, as you say, a hard target?
Yes.
One of the things that the chapter also outlines that I think is a bit of a jewel is the Canadian Cybersecurity Corps. Just give us the highlight on what it is.
Absolutely. So when I was at the Business Council of Canada, I was very involved in the development of what became known as the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, which was when the largest companies in Canada got together and created an information sharing network that allowed for actionable intelligence to go out to the private sector. Canada has expertise in cybersecurity in many corners of its country. When I went to visit the major university in Israel that had where the Israel Cyber Corps and so on is located, there was the University of New Brunswick. And so this is not something that Canadians necessarily think about, but there is an enormous amount of expertise. You also look in Latin America at the growth of cyber attacks. You can go down the list and see institutions that have been hit particularly with ransomware attacks. You've seen organized criminal groups get involved in ransomware as a service, where essentially they will engage in attacks that demand payment to unlock systems on behalf of third parties. So what can Canada do about this? First of all, it can organize and mobilize its knowledge base and its infrastructure and work constructively with countries in the region on strengthening its cyber infrastructure. On the government side, it includes things such as putting in action the hard-earned learnings around the creation of the Canadian Cybersecurity Centre and helping to have a coherent infrastructure for protecting government infrastructure. It also means looking at how do you protect hospitals and universities and other institutions. But of course, when you're putting the cyber core together, the vision is that this will also become a services export. Because when there are major cyber attacks, typically what happens is institutions or countries have to call up major international service providers and pay top dollar in order to be able to get remediation done, to be able to get their data back. So let's find a way to proactively work together. And so Canada puts together the Cyber Corps. First of all, it starts off on a concessional basis, working with countries and institutions to demonstrate what Canada has to offer. But over time, you can transition toward a services contract. So from a Canadian perspective, you get a cyber security services export. You also have a component in there which is absolutely critical, that Canadian educational institutions would work with educational institutions in the countries to train the best cybersecurity talent. So that what you get in countries in the region is a huge base of people who are deeply knowledgeable at the latest techniques that are available, that are part of the Cyber Core network. And so we all become safer. From the Canadian perspective, looking to drive exports, you have a services export, and you get great local partnerships development where you can get institutions in the region that then in time could work with the Canadian Cyber Corps in third countries because you've developed that expertise. And so rather than simply a one-way transfer, we see this as a genuine partnership which makes everyone in the Americas safer.
Marta, yes.
Add you know, if you look around the region today, whether it's left-wing, right-wing, populist, or technocrat, the number one political issue in every Latin American country is security. And there is also, right now, a level of distrust directed towards the two biggest, most likely sources of technical transfer, China and the United States. And so this is an opportunity for Canada, with its technical abilities and its goodwill as a partner with integrity, to provide this kind of technical transfer. And if you look over the last 50 years, where has Canada really made an impact through aid and through other programs? It's technical assistance. And it's technical assistance with good policing techniques, with investigative techniques, and now in the cyber world with that kind of technical assistance. This is, to me, a no-brainer, and there's plenty of demand on the Latin American side, and there's plenty of capability on the Canadian side.
I want to ask Marta, Ken, maybe Janice, Jonathan, whoever wants to jump in, but when you pursue a set of strategies like this, arguably the hardest part is deciding what you're not going to talk about, what's not the focus of the paper. How did you arrive at, there's a framing here, how did you arrive at sort of what your focus was going to be, what you wanted to achieve?
Lots of conversation. I don't know if my mic is on or not, but lots and lots of conversation. As Ken mentioned at the beginning, this has been a process for almost 2 years now. And we had conversations with, I'd say, thousands of people, not just that are sitting up here in the room, but also from across the hemisphere and also in Europe. We spoke with people who had other strategies for the region. We've spoke with people from different sectors. And the ones that we landed up on here are really the ones we really believed, going back to the point that Janice and Jonathan made very clear, is that they needed to be actionable. The other point is things have changed in the last 2 years, so you can also understand that some of the things that we had started to speak about 2 years ago weren't necessarily the same framing or the same context anymore globally. So that there was a real shift in that thinking as well throughout the process. But I think more than anything, it's about what's actionable and what is really for Canada as well as for the region. Areas that we can really do partnership, but that there are things that Canada can take on individually as a country itself, and not necessarily need a multilateral institution to go about doing them, like things like environment or climate change or other things like that. So, yeah.
And there is, Jonathan, there's a sense of urgency today that even 2 years ago didn't exist in terms of the needs on the part of Canada, needs of the region also shifting. I mean, the world has definitely changed, but on the part of Canada, the need to diversify and actually change the way we think about how the role government can and should play is different.
Yeah, I think there's a certain amount of serendipity here as well. let's face it. We didn't know 2 years ago how exactly things would play out, but we had an intuition, however, as just referring back to my comments at the outset, that we were experiencing, like everyone else, the same sense of urgency because the tectonic plates had shifted and were seeming to shift even in an accelerated fashion before us. I would say also there's a certain level of urgency because people adapt, right? Countries have agency. And what we see in the region is that no one's standing still. Countries, particularly large countries in the region, they see themselves as geopolitical swing states that will make the best possible deal because they are concerned about the welfare of their people. And they're looking at a world in which there are other options and where there are options that may have greater benefit in the short term, major benefits in the long term. It's a calculus. So the urgency for us, and I think that, frankly, why we think we've landed here at a really timely moment is because we need something to say. And we need actions that we can take that draw back to the continent. There are a lot of pulls and pushes that bring us back to the Americas. And what we're trying to do is provide a little bit of a roadmap and some really actionable options so that we meet that urgency where it is.
Really good question from the room, Eric, on sort of how to spur broad investment in the region. Obviously, we've got a set of tools here that are really geared at awakening the Canadian landscape to the potential here and creating a kind of a shared, the consortium approach, for instance, is applicable across different sectors. It's not all mining. There's Absolutely. A whole bunch of opportunities. The potential for investment is pretty big, I would imagine. We're not putting a dollar figure on it, but it's pretty big which is sort of the ethos of the government in Canada right now, which is bring private capital to the table. Yeah. Government can't do it. Get private capital on board. Do you feel as though you've done that with these policies?
I think we have done that because we are laying out a framework for how private capital can enter into the realization of coherent projects. And so there are great needs on infrastructure and on food processing and other things in Latin America, but there are great needs for a lot of things. What this model is meant to do is to bridge the gap between the potentiality, if that's a word, and the actual realization. Because what I've observed is that if you are an individual company, particularly a smaller or a mid-sized company, you are going to the region and you don't know where to start. You have nothing that you can link on to. And so by pulling together these consortia, you are essentially creating a platform where companies are able to get involved with things. It also means that you have a mindset in Canada where you're looking at, well, there is a need for a new bridge across the river in Asunción, or there is a need for a strengthening of the coastal highway on the north coast of Jamaica, or whatever it is. And so then you have a framework that looks seriously at, does this make sense? And then if it does make sense, you have a platform where this can be presented to private investors, and you have tools within Canadian public institutions around providing guarantees, and you have a better opportunity to advance that. You have a prime that is identified. That prime has an obligation to bring in mid-size and smaller companies, and to use Canadian materials, and to find good local partners in the region. And so what it's meant to do is to provide an action-oriented catalyst to making these projects happen, and to go from saying, yeah, that would really be good to do, to something where there is a process to get you to a go, no-go decision. And if it is go, then to see those projects built.
Yep.
Canada has a long track record of supporting SMEs in their ability to penetrate markets far away. We spend more money on promoting trade on a per capita basis than any country in the world by a long shot, about 30% more than number 2, which is Germany. And yet, and I've been, having lived in Mexico, having accompanied a lot of these trade missions, I have seen that these companies arrive and they're excited and they get all kinds of cultural training before they go, and they arrive, but they don't have the resources and the people to follow up. Because to follow up in an emerging market and make traction probably takes a year and $100,000. And so the idea of housing those companies within a consortia where their client is the larger Canadian company that has the resources to take its time and to invest, that is a approach that the Japanese have mastered, the Koreans have mastered, has been said. And that's how Canada has to rethink its support for SMEs, because they won't make it on their own in emerging markets. The ones that do are 1 in 20. That's the reality.
We're getting up to time here, so I'm going to ask Janice, Jonathan, and then I'm going to make you finish, Ken. What will success look like? I mean, Janice, you've done this work before. You don't want it to sit in a drawer.
No.
What does it look like?
I really do not want it to sit in a drawer. So success looks like, first of all, that parts of our government, and they're different parts, as you can tell, actually take this on. That's number one, and we'll know whether this becomes an area where our government really sees very defined opportunities. 2, I want to see agreements, right? I want to see what John and Eric just talked about. We need to get to the go. This country needs to get to the go, and what the strategy does is lay out how we can do it on the ground in very specific areas. It doesn't dictate the areas, but it really says, here's the processes to get us to a go. And then ultimately, 2-4 years from now, are these partnerships working? And what are the metrics? And we lay out some of them in the report so that we can adjust, right? And calibrate and learn from what doesn't work in a much quicker time frame than we've done in the past. This is about speed as well as about scale. And in the world in which we're living, in this changing world that we're talking about, 2 things really matter. 3, focus, speed, and scale. And that's what this strategy is about.
Jonathan?
Yeah, so what I think success looks like is that we have a mindset shift towards experimentation.
Yeah.
And experimentation is best done in familiar territory.
On the ground.
And the Americas is familiar territory. We have advantages in the region. We are not as heavily contended as we would be in Asia or in Europe, which are important focuses for the government and for Canadians. But this is a familiar place. Canadians have been doing business in this region for 150 years. And so experimentation and curiosity and trying things is how we are going to get forward. And so that would, for me, that would be success.
Ken, the final word is yours. Well, it's really Marta's, but first yours.
It's always Marta.
It's always Marta.
And it always should be Marta.
Yes.
Well, at this point, success for me looks like a good night's sleep. But,
Man up.
We say that we talked about the novelty and the original ideas. We acknowledge that this is going to require some re-engineering in how people think, how they interact. Governments, departments in the government may be interacting way more than they did in the past because all of the recommendations, or many of them, are going to require interdepartmental expertise. And in some places, there may not be any of that expertise, but it's the willingness to take it on and realize that this is a strategy that's not just talking about, it would be nice to have a relationship with Latin America, but this is essential for Canada. And so it would be lovely at the next time one indicator, or Janice and everybody, and Jonathan talked about Marta, a lot of it, but is for the Prime Minister the next time before a major gathering in Latin America to say, we are back with major commitment and engagement, and let me tell you how we're going to do that.
Well, if I may say, having been deeply involved with all of you, I think it is very clear, it is very focused. These are practical ideas that can be implemented, and it's a kudos to all of you, our authors, for bringing novel concepts to an area where that's not always easy to do. So thank you all for your expertise. I'm going to turn it back over to Marta, but thank our panelists.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Before I go any further, I just want to say something a little bit personal here. As a Latin American Canadian, the importance of this region has been at the forefront for me, not just professionally with the CCA, but personally. And to have been part and taken part and watched all of the thinking going on and been part of the developing of this strategy, it's really, really important. It's a strategy that can actually strengthen the relations between Canada and Latin America and the Caribbean is really and has been an honor. So thank you all for all of the work that you've put toward this. Before I close, I do want to take a moment to thank all of the people who made this day possible. First, Janice, Jonathan, Eric, John, Doug, and Ken. Thank you for your insights, your expertise, and your commitment to this project. And last but definitely not least, Amanda. Thank you for, Thank you so much for guiding this conversation today and honestly over the last 18 to 24 months. So thank you. To the team behind the scenes that made today possible, our volunteers, interpreters, tech team, communications and design teams, thank you so much. As Ken mentioned earlier, none of this would have been possible without Nancy Southern's generous support, so thank you again to Nancy. And finally, this strategy is really meant to be a living document, a platform for action and continued dialogue. So we encourage all of you to read it, share it, engage with it, and support it. The English and French versions are already available on our website. Those of you who are in the room, you're welcome to take a printed copy with you in both languages. And we will have Spanish and Portuguese versions available on our website within the coming week. We look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you, from government to business leaders, civil society, and academia. The work of strengthening Canada's engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean requires all of us. So have a very wonderful day. Thank you again. Merci beaucoup. Muchísimas gracias. Obrigada.